Hola chicos y buenas tardes. Hoy vamos a hablar del condicional y también las situaciones hipotéticas usando las cláusulas de sí. Como siempre, puedes encontrar esta información en el libro de texto, en las páginas 342 y 343 para el condicional. Hay dos lados para los apuntes esta noche. Un lado para el condicional y el otro para las cláusulas de sí. So about halfway through the video, you're going to want to switch over to the other side of your notes. Remember that you need to be writing down any questions that you might have for me, and any notes for things that you think you might want to remember. So let's talk about the conditional first. Remember that the conditional is pretty much the same as the future. We're going to start with the infinitive form and then add our endings. Our endings are going to be the same for all ER, AR, and IR verbs. It is important that we start with the infinitive though, because especially with the conditional, because if we don't and we remove the last, the ending of the infinitive and add our forms, you actually are going to be using the imperfect when you want to be using the conditional. So for example, if we're looking at hablar, we're going to start with our infinitive and then add ia, ias, ia, iamos, iais, and ion. And then don't forget that there is an accent on all of the I forms, on all of the I's in this form. And that is important. So let's look at some other examples. We have an AR, ER, and IR verb. Tomar, just like hablar, tomaría. Comer, start with the infinitive, comería, and vivir, viviría. And the ER and IR verbs are where it's important to make sure that you're using the infinitive. Because if we take off that ending, if we take off that ER or the IR, we're going to end up using the imperfect where we really want to be using the conditional. Of course, there are some irregulars. They are going to be the same exact ones as they are for the future. So for hacer and decir, we're going to drop the middle letters and end up with dir and ar. So we get diría, dirías, etc. Haría, harías, etc. There are a couple verbs we're going to leave out the last E. Haber, poder, querer, and saber. So we're left with habría, podría, querría, and sabría. And that's continued all the way through those forms. Again, ia is our ending for all of them. And then there are four more. We're just going to lose the last vowel, either the E or the I, in the ending and replace it with a D. So we're left with pondría, saldría, tendría, and vendría. So how are we going to use the conditional? We're going to use the conditional to talk about things that we would do under certain circumstances. Now, we usually use the conditional to describe hypothetical situations, to talk about what we would do if certain circumstances were to happen. For that case, we're most of the time going to use an if clause. The conditional can be used by itself. For example, vivirías en España? Would you live in Spain? Sí, hablaríamos español mucho si viviéramos en España. If we lived in Spain, we would speak Spanish a lot. And we're going to talk about those if clauses in just a second. The conditional is also used to talk about events in the past. It actually is a past tense. We're going to use it to talk about events that are either one more past than another, just like we talk about the future being in relationship to the present. So in the future tense, we might say, mañana en clase hablaré con el profesor, leeré un cuento chistoso y escribiré unas frases. But using the conditional, we would say, ayer te dije que hoy, so we're talking about yesterday, that we would do something today. Hablaría con el profesor, leería un cuento chistoso y escribiría unas frases. So we were talking about something yesterday that we would do today. So let's look at it a little bit on a timeline. If we start with the present, remember that the future is going to be something that hasn't happened yet. At some point in the future, yo hablaré con Juan. Okay, if we move the present and we look towards the past, we're going to see the preterite, which is 1 point on the timeline. And yesterday I told you that I would do something more in the future, and that's where the conditional comes in. Okay, it's more future than the past. So it's kind of in between the past and the present. We can also use conditional to talk about probability, just like we use the future tense to describe probability in the present. So we're talking about probability in the past as opposed to probability in the present. If I said, ¿Dónde está María? If she's not in class today, I might say, ¿Estará enferma? She's probably sick. That's me expressing probability, not necessarily discussing what somebody will or won't do. So we're going to use the conditional in a similar way to talk about conjecture or probability in the past. If I'm talking about where Maria was last night, I would say no sé, estaría enferma. She must have been sick. She probably was sick. Instead of she probably is sick, she probably was sick. ¿Qué hora sería cuando llegamos a casa? Serían las 10. What time was it when we got home? Oh, it was probably 10 o'clock. So again, this is a way that we're going to avoid using the terms probablemente, because that's not necessarily a natural way to do that in Spanish. So for this part of your reflection, I want you to answer these questions. Go ahead and pause the video and jot these things down. We use the conditional tense usually to mean what? How do we use the conditional to discuss things in the past? And how do you use future and conditional to express probability? Go ahead and jot those things down and then restart the video when you're ready to move on to talk about if clauses. Okay, so in order to talk about if clauses, we first have to talk about the imperfect subjunctive, el imperfecto del subjuntivo. It's going to be formed with this formula. We're going to start with the third person plural of the preterite, okay, the aron or the ieron form, like hablaron, vendieron, or escribieron. If you start with the third person plural, remember, and you know your preterite, there aren't any irregular forms, okay? In other words, there isn't a verb that doesn't follow the rule. I know you're going to say, but of course there are irregulars. There are 1,000 irregulars in the past in the preterite tense. Yes, there are, but if you know your preterite, then you have no irregular forms in the past subjunctive. So we're going to drop the ron. So we're going to drop the ron of hablaron, vendieron, and escribieron. And we're going to add the ras, okay? Ra, ras, ra, ramos, rice, ron. So, for example, hablar becomes hablara, hablaras, hablara, habláramos, hablares, hablaran. And it is important that you note that there aren't any written accent forms here, because if I said hablará, that would actually be the future tense. This one is hablara. Vender is going to become vendiera, vendieras, vendiera, vendiéramos, vendierais, vendieran. And escribir, escribiera, escribieras, escribiera, escribiéramos, escribierais, escribieran. Note there is an accent on all of the forms in nosotros. ER and IR forms are going to be identical. The endings are identical. They're going to look identical because they're starting with the preterite. And the first and third persons are also going to be the same. Therefore, you're going to have to clarify using subject pronouns. Okay, so here are some common regular and irregular verbs. Tomar is normal, so we're going to start with tomaron and go to tomara. Beber, also normal. Escribir, also normal. That's what those are going to look like when you take off the ron form and start forming the imperfect subjunctive. Creer, remember, it changes to creyeron with a Y. It's a spell-changing verb in the preterite. So we're going to keep that in the past subjunctive, and it's going to become creyera. Okay, decir, same thing. Dijeron, it's one of those column 2 verbs. The special preterites. Same thing with a star. Haber. Those are all going to change to dijera, estuviera, and hubiera based on their preterite forms. So the important thing to remember is that you have to know your preterite forms. If you know your preterite forms, then there are not going to be any irregulars. Poder, poner also have those irregularities. En querer, saber, all special preterites. Ser, tener, traer, and venir. So these are what these are going to look like. If you know, one more time, if you know your preterite, then there aren't going to be any irregulars. Okay, so how are we going to use the past subjunctive? There are a variety of ways to use the past subjunctive, but what we're concerned about right now is just using it with hypothetical situations. So I want you to remember this formula. Sips would. Si plus the past subjunctive, then the conditional. So it's always going to be si if plus the past subjunctive, tuviera, estuviera, hablara, whatever the case may be. Si tuviera más dinero, yo viajaría a España. So if I had more money, I would travel to Spain. And we're going to use this to talk about situaciones hipotéticas o situaciones que son contrarias a la realidad, ¿ok? Okay, so if I had more money, I would travel to Spain. You can also switch those clauses around and eliminate the comma. Yo viajaría a España si tuviera más dinero. In whatever case, the si is always going to be followed by the past subjunctive. The si will always be followed by the past subjunctive. The viajaría, the conditional, is going to come later. So if you switch those clauses around, you're still going to keep the past subjunctive with the if, with the si. And that's pretty much it. That's your formula. Sips would. So for this part of your reflection, I want you to think, what's the rule for forming the past subjunctive? How do we do it? And then what's the formula that we need to talk about hypothetical situations? Okay, es todo. Buenas noches.